First, we need to get some more books into the database, and we can do that for existing authors, or we can add any new authors and their books that have come under the publisher's umbrella. Remember that an author can have one or more books, and the book class has an author property and an author ID property, which is a foreign key that connects it back to an author. And in the database, this results as a primary key foreign key constraint, which we also fondly refer to as a PKFK constraint. In the program class, I have a new method where I'm creating a new parent-child graph. That's a new author with a new book in its books collection. Then I'm calling the author's dbSetAdd method, passing in the new author object graph to tell the context to begin tracking the author and whatever's attached to it. I'd like to pause for a moment to make sure you know what I mean by the word graph. This is a common software term for a connected set of related data in memory. So when I say I have a graph of author and books in memory, that means an author object with some books in its books property. And you may have a different focal point for a head of a graph. You could have a variable that represents one of those books in the graph, but through that book variable, you still have access to the rest of the connected objects that are in memory, even a parent author object. So we would even refer to that book variable as a graph. When I add the author object with the add method, because the author has a book connected, the context will be aware of the book as well. And the context will mark everything in the graph as added. And when I call save changes, because it understands the parent-child relationship, it first inserts the author, and like you saw earlier, it then returns the database-generated ID of that new author data. Then EF-Core takes that ID, which in our case is 7, and uses it to compose the SQL insert for the book. So it's pushing that parameter value of 7 into the book's author ID column. You may be familiar with having to write that explicit code in olden times of programming without the benefit of an ORM to do that work for you. If there were multiple new books in the books list property, as I'm doing the next method, notice in the log that after the parent is inserted and EF gets back the value of the new key, it's using that value to insert both of the quotes. And of course, if there were 4 or more quotes here, you would see all of those insert commands coming in as a single batched command. But what if you want to add a related object to a pre-existing object? In other words, a new book for an author that's already had other books published. Well, there are a few ways to do that, and I prepared you for this when we were modeling the author-books relationship earlier in this course. We'll start by adding the child to the child collection of an existing parent that's being tracked. Here's a method where I'm retrieving an author from the database, and then I'm adding a new book to the author's books property. What's important here is that the context is still tracking the author, so it knows that I added the new book. And just to be clear, it doesn't know it at the moment that I add it. It recognizes it when internally the detect changes method is called, which will happen as part of the save changes command, as we saw earlier in the course. And when I call save changes, you can see in the log the parameters to the new book's insert command includes the author ID. In code, I never set that foreign key value. The change tracker figured that out because it was tracking the author. And notice that I never called add on the DB context or one of the DB sets. The context was already aware of the author, and I just pushed that book into its collection and called save changes. Even though you just saw that you don't need to call add in this scenario, I want to be very sure you're aware of a problem that would occur if for some reason you use the DB context author's add method to make sure the book got added to the database. If you're new to working with EF-Core, this may not be obvious yet. By passing the author into the author's dbSetAdd method, the author is going to get marked as added, even objects that already have a primary key field, even objects that were already being tracked and were just retrieved from the database. So when you call save changes in that scenario, EF-Core will construct insert statements for all the objects, and the ones that already have their key values in the database will have those values in the insert command, and the database will be very unhappy because by default, you're not allowed to insert identity values. And even if you were, it would be a duplicate and would break the primary key constraint. So it's really important to understand these behaviors rather than following your gut and letting IntelliSense do all of your important coding for you. Because I have an author reference in my book class, there's another way I could add a new book for an existing author. This still means that I have to have the author object in memory. So first, I'm creating a new book. Then in a single line of code, I'm setting its author property to the result of the find method for that author. And this is representing a scenario where I am 100% sure that I'm not going to get null back from the find. Then I'm adding this book to the books DB set. Now I've run this with a breakpoint to stop just before I call save changes. Let's take a look at the debug view. Remember, we've got some really great tools for helping us debug or just learn how things are working. The book is added and it's got the foreign key set. But the author is unchanged. So that's interesting. When I added the author and book graph to the authors DB set, EF-Core explicitly changed author to added. But when I'm adding the same kind of graph, an existing author and a new book, using the books DB set, it didn't override the state of the author. So again, don't make assumptions about how the behavior is going to be. The EF-Core team has designed it to follow what they understand to be the most common needs. Now I'll call save changes, and like before, EF-Core pulled the author ID from the author object and set it into the book's author ID foreign key property. And it didn't try to add the author this time. Here's another way, and it's my favorite. If I already know the key value of the author, but the object is not yet in memory, it seems kind of silly to me to query the database for the author using the ID when I can just set the author ID property of this new book to that key value that I already know. Another bonus is that I don't have to worry about accidentally trying to reinsert the author object. Sometimes developers don't want to have foreign key properties in their dependent classes. They're worried that it makes their classes dirty because the foreign key property is an expression of something needed for the database. But as you can see, foreign key properties make life a lot easier. And I'm constantly encouraging my clients and anyone else who will listen to me to take advantage of those foreign keys. Be aware that some of this behavior will be different when you're in disconnected scenarios like web apps, and we'll look more closely at that later in the course. Now that we've got some data to work with, it's time for some queries. There are a number of ways to query related data. Eager loading allows you to use the dbset include method to retrieve data and its related data in the same query. You'll learn about other ways in the next few clips of this module. So for now, let's focus on eager loading with include. Here's a query starting with an author's dbset. Include is a method of dbset, but you'll need a using statement for the Microsoft Entity Framework Core namespace. Include takes a lambda as a parameter to define which navigation or collection property I want to include, and that's going to be the author's books. Don't forget a link execution method at the end. I'll use toList to get all of the authors with their books. I'm also adding a little logic to output the authors and their books to the console. Once I've run this method, checking out the logs, the first thing we see is that EF-Core created a left join query to retrieve the authors and their books. And looking at the output list of authors and books, there are all of the authors and the books for each of the authors who does have a book in the database. Remember when we looked at the query workflow earlier in this course, the last piece of that was that the DB context would connect any related objects that came back from the query. And that's how the author objects knew which books belonged in its collections. By default, include with a navigation collection, such as the books property, brings back all of the items in that collection. But it is possible to filter and even sort that included data. And this capability is a huge deal for people who've been working with EF or EF-Core for any amount of time. filtering and sorting the included data has only been a possibility since EF Core 5. So before I change the query, let's take a peek at the raw data. There's a wide range of published dates. Let's get the books that were published since 2010. Now, back in the code, here's a revised version of my query. And inside the include method, where I've expressed that I want the books included, I'll add a where method to filter down the books that get returned to just those whose published date is greater than or equal to 2010. I can also use the order by method, and I'll do that to sort each author's books by title. When I run this query and look again at the output, first you can see that the SQL is now applying the filter to the select books clause in the left join, and the book title has been added to the order by clause. And in the output, all the authors are still there, but the older books by Rhoda Lerman and Ursula K. Le Guin aren't there anymore. With the authors, the core of the query, you can still do all the things you learned earlier about querying in combination with the include. For example, you can filter on which authors you want and then bring along their books. Or after the include, you can use other link execution methods like first or default. Just remember that include is a method of dbset, so you can't append it to an execution method. An execution method might be returning a list of authors or a single author, and include isn't a method of either of those types. Nor can you use include in combination with find. Remember that just like include, find only works directly on a DB set. There are a variety of ways that you can build graphs with eager loading. You can have multiple levels of includes. For example, if we were tracking the book jacket designs for each book, in my query for the authors, not only can I include the books, but I can drill even further using EF Core's then include method to drill into the books and pull back all of the book jacket objects for the books. So I'm saying get the authors, include the books, then include the book jackets for the books. You can also traverse graphs in multiple directions. For example, I might have a contact info class and be using that as a property in author. So in a single query, I could ask for authors along with the author's books and the author's contact info. In that case, you would compose the query with two include methods because they are both including directly from the author. Include books and include contact info. Another interesting way to eager load is to use one property as a pass-through, but not actually retrieve the objects of that property. For example, I might want to see all of the book jacket designs for a particular author. I don't want the actual book information, but I have to go through books to get the jackets because book jackets is a property of books. My include expression could then navigate from author to books to book jackets. I won't dig more deeply into this, but I wanted to be sure you were familiar with these possibilities. Do be considerate of the possibility of creating performance issues if you really pile on the includes in a single query. I've had a number of clients reach out to me with performance issues that are caused exactly by this. There's another interesting point related to performance with includes. By default, as you've seen, EF Core is creating a single SQL command from the query. In some cases, breaking the SQL down into multiple SQL commands sent to the database and then pulling all the data back together when it's returned might lead to a better performance option. To that point, there is a method to be aware of that you can use with include called as_split_query. The resulting data won't be any different, but the performance could be impacted. Again, it's another thing to keep in mind as you venture beyond the fundamentals.